Russia is not winning the war. I think they need to sit back and realize that Ukraine is currently in a pretty good position. That's not my words. That's coming from General Kellogg, the U.S. Special Envoy to Russia-Ukraine negotiations, with probably the most optimistic phrasing of the current situation that I've heard yet from this administration. Now, this comes amidst some rumors that the ceasefire talks entirely are falling apart, and we're going to get into that, as well as a tragic story about a Ukrainian journalist that was abducted, tortured, killed, and her body mutilated while in Russian captivity. Starting out with the statement here from General Kellogg on Fox News. Let's go ahead and play that now.
No, look, Dana, Russia's not winning this war. Russia has not made any major advances in the last year and a half. They haven't taken the city of Kyiv, the capital. They haven't pushed to the west of the Dnieper River, which is a major obstacle. They haven't taken Odessa. They've lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and they haven't really moved anything. It moves by meters, not by miles. And the Ukrainians are fighting on their own soil. They're fighting hard. So when Russia says they're winning, no, they're not. If they are winning, they've already won this war after 3 years, and now we're into our fourth year. So I think they need to sit back and realize it. I think the Ukrainians are in a good position.
Now, this kind of follows some increased pressure from Trump against Putin, and that really followed a meeting between Zelensky and President Trump in the Vatican during the Pope's funeral a couple days ago. And we just got reporting from Barack Ravid and Axios talking about this, iconic photo of the two sitting down with possibly what was discussed, coming from a couple different insiders. In that article, he says Zelensky told Trump that Putin would not budge unless Trump applied more pressure. Zelensky also pushed Trump to return to his initial proposal of an unconditional ceasefire as a starting point for peace talks, which Ukraine accepted but Russia rejected. They say Zelensky reiterated in the meeting that he will not recognize Crimea as Russian, and Trump made clear that he's not asking him to. This is according to one source, adding that the plan calls for U.S. recognition of Crimea, not Ukrainian. The source also said that Zelensky told Trump he's not afraid of making concessions to end the war, but he needs strong enough security guarantees to do so. Now, of course, this is coming from unnamed officials familiar with the situation or may have been there themselves. All of this does kind of add up. It makes sense. These are things you would expect Zelensky to say. It looks like this is the type of stuff that Trump is acting on in the following days. And the last one is key, and I want to make sure we spend some time on that. The concessions that Ukraine is willing to make. There's plenty, and they've already made some for what it's worth. By far and away, the number one sticking point for Zelensky and European and Ukrainian leaders right now are security guarantees, and that has been the case for quite a while. Now, we've got this, I would say, relatively positive movement recently. We did a whole video yesterday about how some voices on the right are starting to maybe suggest more support for Ukraine, but it's not all sunshine and roses. I mean, this is, again, a clip that we played yesterday from Vice President Vance. Amidst all of this kind of increased pressure against Russia and the U.S. saying, actually, Ukraine's in a pretty good position. Then we have Vice President Vance going on a podcast saying, Ukraine isn't winning this war. Let's give that a listen.
If this doesn't stop, the Ukrainians aren't winning the war. I think there's this weird idea among the mainstream media that if this thing goes on for just another few years, the Russians will collapse, the Ukrainians will take their territory back, and everything will go back to the way that it was before the war. That is not the reality that we live in.
Now, to be fair, they're kind of saying two totally different things. We have Vice President Vance saying that Ukraine is not winning, and then we have General Kellogg saying that Russia is not winning. Right, so there's some sunlight between those two. Both of those things technically could be true at the same time. I just want to bring that up because it highlights the disconnect that we're seeing right now in this administration, how they're approaching trying to bring about an end to this conflict. It does not seem like we've got a cohesive message across all parties. And to add to that, President Trump had an interview last night in the Oval Office talking about a lot of things. A little bit of it was talking about Ukraine, Putin, and Russia. And I'll go ahead and play that segment here because I'm not entirely sure what the takeaway is. There were some interesting statements, but worth a watch. Here we go.
Don't forget, you think he wants peace? You think Vladimir Putin wants peace?
I think he does, yes. I think
Still.
he does. I think because
even with the raining missiles
I think he really, his dream was to take over the whole country. I think because of me, he's not going to do that.
Do you trust him?
I think.
Do you trust him?
I don't trust you. I don't trust a lot of people. I don't trust you. Look at you. You come in all shooting for bear. You're so happy to do the interview.
I am
And
happy.
then you start hitting me with fake questions. You start telling me that a guy whose hand is covered
All
with
right,
a
we're back to
tattoo doesn't have the tattoo. You know.
All right.
I mean, you're being dishonest.
No, I'm not.
Let me
No, I
just
am
tell
not,
you,
sir.
I don't trust a lot of people. But I do think this. I think that let's say he respects me, and I believe because of me, he's not going to take over the whole. But his decision, his choice would be to take over all of Ukraine. Okay.
So a couple of key thoughts there. First off, I feel like any U.S. leader involved in these negotiations has to say that they think Putin wants peace. Whether they believe it or not right now, it doesn't do any good to walk into those negotiations and kind of beforehand have come to the conclusion and stated publicly that Putin is not willing to negotiate. If that's the case, why are we there at all? So I get that piece. Not a big surprise that we see Trump talking about the respect between he and Putin. We've heard that before. The statement about how Russia would have taken all of Ukraine if it weren't for Trump definitely caught some backlash. I mean, there's, some Ukrainian soldiers, military, and civilians for that matter, that may have something to say with that. But nonetheless, this comes amidst a report in Bloomberg yesterday saying that the ceasefire talks for now may have completely stalled out. They said negotiations have reached an impasse for now, and it requires direct contact between Putin and Trump to make further progress. Some interesting pieces in here. They say that Putin is insisting that Russia must take control of the 4 regions of Ukraine it does not fully occupy as part of any agreement to end the war, according to 3 people in Moscow familiar with the matter. Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, sought to persuade Putin that Russia should agree to a ceasefire that halts fighting along the current front lines during lengthy talks at the Kremlin on Friday. Instead, the Russian leader maintained his maximalist position on territory. So kind of parse through that real quick to make it easier to understand. I'll pull up a map here so we can look at this. Russia has claimed ownership of really 5 territories of Ukraine. Crimea, which is entirely under Russian control at this point, and then from south to north, Kherson, Zaporozhye, Luhansk, and Donetsk. And they only control, I'd say probably like 90% maybe in total of those territories. The front line moves directly through a couple of those areas. So Russia says, we own this entire thing, not just what we're sitting on top of and physically control, but that section over there, like in Kherson, across the river, they say, we own that too. That's ours. The maximalist demand that Putin is throwing out there is saying that Ukraine has to abandon those territories, move their military back, and that essentially cede territory to Russia that Ukraine currently sits on. Again, internationally recognized Ukrainian territory. So you can see how the maximalist demands are kind of shifting here. That freezing the conflict on the current line of the current front lines has really been in every negotiation talking point so far. And it seems like just in the last 24 or 48 hours, Putin has said, yeah, not good enough. Now, Russia did kind of come to the table with something in recent days, although we got to treat this with some skepticism. According to this one is being reported in Associated Press, but it's got a lot of coverage now. Putin has on Monday declared a unilateral 72-hour ceasefire next week to mark Victory Day in World War II as the U.S. presses for a deal. Ukraine has pushed back on this, saying, why not just a 30-day truce? And why are you waiting until next week? But the Kremlin said that this truce is for humanitarian reasons and it will run from May 8th through May 10th. Notably, they have the Victory Day parade on May 9th. There's a lot of people from around the world, a lot of international leaders coming to this. And I think I've got the graphic showing who's coming, some notable figures, kind of a who's who of not the closest U.S. allies, maybe is a nice way to put it. Nonetheless, there does appear to be some concern inside of Russia that Ukraine might try to strike the parade. The most, I would say, the most worried that I'm hearing in Russia is that Ukraine would actually try to use a drone or an IED or something to strike the viewing booth with all the VIPs. To me, that seems unlikely and also very, very irresponsible for Ukraine with all of these world leaders there. But there is a lot of concern that all of these military formations lining up in Moscow side by side with their equipment could make for a pretty tempting target. And there's an argument here that that's what Russia is trying to avoid. Hey, maybe we can get this ceasefire in place, and then while we have all these foreign dignitaries in Moscow for this parade, we don't have these air raid sirens going off with air defense trying to intercept Ukrainian drones in the middle of the day. You can kind of see that argument. Now, the Ukrainian foreign minister here said, quote, if Russia truly wants peace, it must cease fire immediately. He emphasized that Ukraine is ready for a lasting, reliable, and complete ceasefire. Why wait for May 8th? If we can cease fire now from any date and for 30 days so it is real and not just for a parade. So Ukraine is kind of calling this one out as well, saying, you're just doing this for show. And we should mention the Easter ceasefire from a week or two or a couple weeks ago was violated, I want to say north of 3,000 times by Russia. Like, we can't even really refer to that as a ceasefire. It was any other day in this conflict. The only thing that changed when Russia unilaterally implemented that one-day ceasefire was they appear to have not used long-range munitions to strike Ukrainian infrastructure deep behind the line of contact. That was it. But those started right back up as soon as that window was over. So, got to be careful with anything Putin says around a possible ceasefire. Now I want to shift into a pretty awful story that just came out in the last couple days. It's the story of Viktoriia Roshchyna. My apologies for the pronunciation there. She's a Ukrainian journalist who was abducted, or not abducted, but captured inside of occupied territory, tortured, killed, and then her body mutilated before it was returned. And I'm going to link this investigation. This specific one is being done by The Guardian. I'll link this in the description below for anybody interested in reading in its entirety. This sounds like it's going to be the first piece of many as I was reading through it, so expect more to come out here. So they say Viktoriia Roshchyna was captured in the summer of 2023 near the Zaporozhye nuclear power station. It was at least her fourth trip reporting into the occupied territories. She was, by this stage of the war, the only Ukrainian journalist prepared to risk crossing the front line in order to pierce the information blackout imposed by Russia. It's an important piece here. She is traveling in, she's going behind the lines. The way she does that is interesting, but she's going behind the lines into Russia to try to report what's happening inside of Ukrainian territory currently occupied by Russian forces. And as anybody who's been following this war knows, the information coming out from those territories is like zero at all. So this is what she was trying to get through. They say she died after a year in detention, age 27. She was held without charge and without access to a lawyer. During her detention, her only known contact with the outside world was a 4-minute phone call to her parents a full year after she was taken. Preliminary forensics suggest, quote, numerous signs of torture, according to the prosecutor, burn marks on her feet from electric shocks, abrasions on the hips and head, a broken rib. Her head had been shaved. Sources close to the investigation also say that the hyoid bone in her neck, I'm probably mispronouncing that, HYOID, was broken, which is the kind of damage that can occur during strangulation. But the exact cause of death may never be known because when her body was returned this past February, certain parts were missing, namely the brain, the eyes, and the larynx. What? Like, again, and they say, I should mention here, that a war crimes investigation has been opened with a view prosecuting those that are responsible. And we're going to get into her whole story here as to how she ended up behind Russian lines and experiencing those prisons. But just to reiterate, this is not a soldier. This is not a combatant. This is a journalist. All right? Keep that in mind as we go through this. A Ukrainian journalist detained in Ukraine, for what it's worth, just at the time happened to be occupied by a foreign army. They say a photo of her passport and her entrance form obtained by this investigation suggests she entered Russia from Latvia under her own name via the Ludonka border crossing. The card states she was headed to the city of Melitopol. She traveled 1,000 miles south through Russia, crossing into occupied Ukraine a few days later. Now, a lot of this was pieced together over the course of this investigation by people that were either in the same prison as Viktoriia or crossed paths with her throughout her detention. And they say that she thought she was spotted by a drone shortly thereafter, like right when she got into this area. Police car picked her up, moved her into captivity, and then she was moved over to something called the Melitopol garages, I guess, which was just torture. They say during the interrogations, they used electric shocks. She got stabbed a few times. This is according to one of the people that lived with her in one of these prisons. I saw them on her, arm for sure, leg too, fresh knife scar, forearm, soft tissue between wrist and elbow, a scar of roughly 3 centimeters pierced through. She said one guy, she called him a jerk, was brutal and unhinged. On her leg above the heel, I saw 2, 5-centimeter wound. I told them not to touch my leg. Quote, I begged them not to touch that wound. Viktoriia talking with her cellmate there. And they say towards the end of 2023, she was told by an FSB officer that she would be transferred to another prison in Tangarog. She was detained at a pretrial detention center known as SIZO-2, S-I-Z-O-2. Once she got there, they were able to interact with some other detainees who actually met her and spent time with her, and some of these have been released. So this is not the type, it's a brutal prison, but it's also not necessarily like the type of prison that nobody comes out of. There are Ukrainians that have been held there and have been returned in prisoner exchanges, so we have an idea of what actually takes place inside this prison. One of those people who has already been released said, quote, she arrived already pumped full of unknown drugs. She arrived and basically she started to go crazy. The conditions were among the worst seen at many of the detention facilities operated by Russia. For Viktoriia, the effect was catastrophic. She stopped eating, and her weight dropped to 30 kilograms. It's like 65 pounds. It's tiny, wasting away. In April 2024, her family received the first official confirmation that she was alive in a letter from the Russian Defense Ministry. It stated that she had been, quote, detained and is currently in the territory of the Russian Federation. Again, civilian journalist. Okay, there's been no accusations at this point from anything in Russia that I've seen, even suggesting that she is a combatant or a spy, which sometimes you get countries like Russia that just throw that label on everyone, say spy, and then we'll do whatever we want with you. I haven't even seen that presented by Russia at this point. Then towards the end of August, she was allowed to call home, and according to her parents on that call, she said that she was promised she would return home in September, or that's what she was told, and she wrapped up the call by saying, well, that's it. Bye, Mom. Bye, Dad. I love you. But then the following release, the September release, she wasn't there. There were other members from her prison in this release, but Viktoriia wasn't. And the father didn't accept. They eventually got a body on February, in this past February. Again, almost impossible to recognize. They've done DNA matching to be able to identify that it is her, but incredibly mutilated. And her father hasn't come to terms with this or hasn't accepted this. So he's been pushing back on the prison here, and the CISO director has replied twice to the father saying, your daughter was never and has never been here. So that appears to be the stance that Russia has taken in regards to this. But again, the investigation is ongoing. If you want to read the report from The Guardian in detail, it will be linked in the description below. But I think it's an important but tragic one to highlight as this war continues. But that's all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.